We're real excited. We got John Hoyt, CISO of Clemson University, coming to talk to us about, from technical to tactical, how to use storytelling to help, sell your story that you're trying to do with whatever projects you're going. So welcome, John. Take it away. Awesome. We'll see you in 25 minutes.
Let's do it. All right. So, yeah, I am the CISO at Clemson University. I kind of went from help desk to desktop support to server administration to kind of a jack of all trades to eventually security. And then moved up to a SOC manager, then a director of security, and then a deputy CISO, then finally CISO. So I've kind of done everything, and I'm going to talk about some stories that have happened along the way that, there are some war stories, some interesting stories, but also talk about how to use stories, in your career, in a job interview, and whatever. So the first story I'm going to talk about, so in 2016, one of the things we have at Clemson is a student-run SOC. So we have students that work with us in a SOC. We started this in February 2016. And the school year was starting in August, right? First week of school, everybody's excited. It's a new energy on campus. It's always great. And we had a new student coming in who was a grad student and wanted to do some research. She was interested in doing denial of service research. So I had a professor reach out to me and said, hey, I've got this student, she's super smart. She wants to learn some things about security, some hands-on practical things. And can she come work with you in the SOC? And I was like, this sounds awesome. We're still new, still fresh in the students and working with students. But she came on board and she told me, she said, I'm interested in denial of service and researching how it works and how you can use security tools to detect it. I said, awesome. So what we'll do is I'll set you up a couple virtual machines, an attacker machine and a victim machine, and I'll give you a tool to use to kind of emulate or do actual DDoS type attacks. And then we'll see how our security tools either pick it up or don't pick it up and see what happens. So the first day of school rolls around and everything's happening. There's so many new machines, new devices, laptops, desktops, iPads, whatever on campus. So there's already a lot of network traffic that happens on campus. And then later that day in the afternoon, the network starts going down. And really the firewall was crashing. And, I didn't really think much about it. We have a primary and a secondary firewall, and they roll over to the secondary, which is great. But they had to figure out what was going on, what happened to the primary. Well, that was on a Wednesday. I vividly remember it. And then Thursday rolled around, nothing happened. And then on Friday, it started happening again. And it's like, what is going on? Well, one of the network guys sends me a message, and he says, hey, does this IP address look familiar to you? And I'm like, no, I don't think so. And I X'd out the last octets of the IP, but it was an IP address in Taiwan. And it's like, I have no idea. So I started looking and digging into the network traffic of this IP address, and I saw all this traffic coming from inside the network going out to basically attack this address. And it was random traffic, random source addresses, no real pattern to it that made sense. And I'm sitting there thinking about it, and then as I'm looking at the IP address, I realize that it's one off from the victim machine that I had given my student to do denial of service attacks. And she had, inadvertently brought down the entire network with one virtual machine and one tool that I'm not going to tell you the name of the tool. Yeah. Maybe later, after, right? So I had this realization, right? I'm sitting there and it hit me. I was like, wait a minute. This is on, our system. This is my student doing this. We're trying to tout this whole program we've got, right? Doing this thing with students. And here I go, we brought down the network, not one time, but 2 times, right? What am I going to tell, my leadership, and what am I going to tell the network team? What am I going to tell? Everybody's going to know that this happened. Oops. But really, I could have like swept this on the rug. Nobody knew that we were doing this. Nobody knew that this IP was this Taiwan IP, had nothing to do with this activity. The way this tool worked, right, it spoofs the source address, so that's why it had so many random source IPs. Nobody knew the true IP. But, in security, integrity, honesty, and in life, right, it's, if you, especially security, if you can't trust your security team to be honest about what's happening, then who can you trust? So I had, I had a call with my boss, and I said, hey, you know how the network went down? Well, that was us. And really, it was my fault. It was me, because I should have been watching her and making sure, that the IP addresses she was attacking was not Taiwan. It was us. It was our little lab. And now, little did I know that it was going to bring down the entire the firewall. And ultimately, packets are going out, right? Everything that goes out, the firewall has to check and say, yeah, this is good. Yes, this is good. Well, literally DDoS the firewall. Yeah, internally. So some lessons I learned from that, like I said, honesty, integrity, but really extreme ownership. I was like new as a SOC manager, new as a leader, and I literally had just read this book, Extreme Ownership. So, and about that, in that book, it just talks about how you as a leader, the mistakes that happen, that's on you, right? You are in charge. It's not somebody else. You can't give that. I could have been like, man, I can't believe this student did this. But that's not how it works in leadership. And eventually, things moved on, except for the network team doesn't let me live it down to this day, right? They bring it up. You remember that time when yes, I remember. I'm never going to forget. And, we're never doing that kind of testing ever again, so don't mention it. But that's just a story, one story about, something that happened to me and some lessons learned. But I want to talk about just storytelling in general. Right, and these two books, this gentleman, Matthew Dix, he's an author, a speaker. He's done the Moth Grand Slam. He's won the Moth Grand Slam. If you've ever heard of the Moth speaking, he's amazing. And I would look and learn about storytelling, and really couldn't find anybody that actually could teach me how to do it. Right, if you ever ask somebody like, how did you learn how to be good at this? Nobody really had good information. Until I came across his information, really. And in my opinion, it really changed my perspective on how to tell stories. And I'm going to talk about some of those things today. But get the books. They're definitely more. I don't have enough time to go through the whole thing. But first off, why tell a story, right? Why is it important to tell a story? Well, because, when you go and you're trying to convince people of information, either convince them to remember you and you're in an interview, convince them to believe you, that you're trying to influence them, people don't really connect on data and charts and figures, right? People connect emotionally, and a story is the best way to make that connection. People tap into stories, and then you can back that up with data. But if you just go in and you just give them the charts and the figures, think about how many presentations you might see in your lifetime that are PowerPoint. There's a reason it's called death by PowerPoint, that you forget later on, right? That you're like, oh yeah, what was that talk? What was that presentation? You'll forget it. So in my opinion, and in Matthew Dick's opinion, you should use storytelling. But what is a story? Not everything is a story. Video games have stories, movies have stories, TVs have stories, but what makes a story a story? And really, in his book, he talks about a story needs one of two things. It needs to have some change where it's either transformation or realization. There was a moment when you were this way and something happened and I was changed and now I'm this way. I used to believe this, then this thing happened and now I'm changed. So if you don't have a transformation or a change, then it's really not a story, it's an anecdote, or it's a retelling of events that happen. So for every great story, the way he puts this in a good way is that it needs a 5-second moment. That's when that change happens. If there's not a 5-second moment, in the protagonist and if you're the protagonist's mind, then you're missing that change moment. So a good example is Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? I love Indiana Jones. And at the beginning, if you haven't seen this, I'm going to spoil it. It's okay. It's old. In the beginning of the movie, You got Indiana Jones, and the government shows up, and they're like, "Hey, the Nazis are trying to steal all these religious artifacts. They think there's some power here. They're trying to steal." And they're talking to Indiana, Dr. Jones. They're showing him the Ark of the Covenant, and it's got these beams of light coming out of it. And they're like, "Hey, what is that, Dr. Jones?" And he's like, "Oh, the power of God," or some such nonsense, right? So he doesn't believe in any of that spirituality or mess. But this scene at the end, and he's tied to the pole, and he's got Marion there, and he's like, "Marion, shut your eyes," right? Because he's changed. He's like, now I believe something bad is going to happen. And if you haven't seen it, bad things happen. Lightning, explosion, the Nazis, it doesn't turn out good for the Nazis. But he has this change moment. There's a beginning where he doesn't believe in this, and at the end, toward the end, he's changed. Okay, so that's the 5-second moment for Dr. Jones. So in my story, there's a couple things, but really when there was, we had this team of students and everything's going great, and then I had a realization like it was us that brought down the network. And I learned from that, and it was good. It was a good lesson. It was a hard lesson, but it was a good lesson. So if you have your 5-second moment, that's the most important thing. And really, in order to build your story, you need the beginning. And the good thing is if you have that moment of change, then you need to start at the opposite end of that. If you think about Dr. Jones, Indiana, there's the change from where he wasn't a believer, then he's a believer. You have to go over that arc to find the difference, right? That's your story. The beginning is the opposite of where you have your 5-second moment. And one thing he talks about in his books is stories should begin with location and action, because you're building like the cinema of the mind. Really, people's imagination is what's building the story. You don't have to fill in all the details. Their imagination will do it. So this is a great tool that, these are some stories that I record, but this tool he talks about is called Homework for Life. And it's really like a mini journaling technique where every day you just write the date down and you write down what's something significant that happened that day. Now, these are pretty significant incidents that happened to me that are all stories that I've curated this list. But generally, it could be something small that happened that could turn into a story later. As you're going back through this list and you're scrolling through it, you may find when you're looking for an idea for a story, one of these moments that stand out. And so I try to keep up with it every day. He's a teacher full-time, even though he's the author and he doesn't need to teach, but he likes to give out homework as a teacher. And he told me, he said, I didn't keep up with it every day, so he gave me an F. I was like, dude, I'm trying. There's a lot going on. Then another tool that he uses is called First, Last, Best, Worst. So this tool is a really neat way, like if you could think about what the prompts might be for an interview. So you have a prompt, you have the first column, the last column, the best column, and the worst column, okay? Well, these prompts could be related to a job, like if somebody asked you about your leadership experience, or what security skills you've learned recently, or what teams you've worked on, or what setbacks you've had in your job, right? And you could talk about, well, my first leadership experience was at Blockbuster Video. And if they asked you that question, well, what did you learn from that experience, right? Setback, for me, bringing down the entire network was a setback. But it's a story, right? And I can share that, and it just helps you mine ideas for stories. And these prompts, you can go to ChatGPT and, hey, give me some prompts related to job interviews or whatever. And as a CISO, I use these techniques all the time, right? Because you're trying to communicate to leadership, and they're not speaking technical, right? You need to be able to speak at their level and make that connection. So how are we doing? Good? Okay, good. I got a story here. It's another good story to wrap it up. So this was October 2016. Everything happened 2016. And one of my students sends us a message in our Slack channel, our student SOC Slack channel, and says, hey, Clemson University is on Brian Krebs' homepage, like the front page of his blog. And if you don't know who Brian Krebs is, he's like the premier journalist in cybersecurity, right? He's the guy. And he does amazing research. Yeah, you don't want to be on his webpage. And so I'm scrolling through, and sure enough, there's a student that is there, and it's literally got his picture with a Clemson logo behind him. And I'm like, man, okay, what's going to happen? So I'm reading through this, and this story is about DDoS, selling the cure, but it's really about DDoS extortion, where this hosting company basically would DDoS their future customers and then sell them like, hey, come with us and you won't be DDoSed. So ultimately extortion, mafia type techniques, right? And Brian alleges that this student, who also was part of another group, was doing this activity. And I'll just call him TJ to protect the presumed innocent, right? And so I'm reading through this, and then toward the end of his story, he says that there was a Skype conversation between him and Brian, and the student's like, yeah, I know all these weaknesses. I've owned all these routers and whatever, but he doesn't like Brian's story about his hosting company. And so they kind of get in this argument, and at the end of it, Brian gets kicked off of Skype. Like, he gets DOSed off of Skype. He gets all these message requests and basically gets DOSed off. And so, okay. But then that evening, he has the largest DDoS ever recorded on the internet at that time that kicks him off the internet. Like, literally wipes his face off the internet. And I'm sitting there like, what? Like, this is a student that is at the university? My first thoughts are like, did they do something on our network, right? Was our network involved? Were our systems involved? So I did two things. One, I reached out to Brian through his website and said, hey, I work at security at the university, and we're investigating this. If you have any information, let me know. And then the other thing is I divide and conquer. I've got the students, and I'm like, all right, Carson, I want you to go here and do this. Grant, I want you to go here and do this, right? Just multiply, force multiply. And we're looking through, I said, I want to know every device the student has. And some of them are like, oh yeah, he's in my, comp sci class. I'm like, oh my gosh, all right, trail him. No, not really. But they, I want to know all his I want to know every network packet he's sent, since this time frame. And so we started investigating. But then I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, wait a minute, his name sounds familiar. So I started looking through emails, and sure enough, I had an email about a ticket he had submitted to our help desk where he had found a vulnerability in one of our websites. And it was a SQL injection vulnerability. And, he could have just kind of dumped the banner for the page, but no, for the database. He dumped the table and the database, the whole database practically. Luckily, it was nothing sensitive. There's no sensitive data, but he wasn't authorized to do so, right? He didn't have permission to do that. And we didn't have like a bug bounty program. So I called up our police department. I just said, hey, listen, I don't know anything. We're investigating this, but literally we're on the front page of Krebs on Security. And this student, did stuff that was not allowed to be done on our network. Yeah. So they are like, okay, they're kind of processing this, and then they really get spun up. But while we're doing that, we're looking through traffic and trying to figure out, is there anything that's happened? And really, we didn't see like a large amount of traffic. And if you go back and read this story, it's a lot. It's a huge DDoS attack. So then Brian reaches out to me, and I have a phone call with him, and it was an interesting conversation. I was like, what do you know? He's like, what do you know? No. And I was like, well, we're investigating. We're looking at this. So far, we don't see anything that indicates, attack from here. But his thoughts were that he's mixed up with the wrong crowd. Like, he knew people. He wasn't the main perpetrator, but he knew those people and maybe their buddies back where he was from, and that he was mixed up with people that he shouldn't be. So 3-letter agencies get involved. The next thing I hear from our police department, DHS is showing up, and basically that they're coming to talk to this kid because they went and picked him up and brought him to the jail. I don't know if they put him in jail, but they definitely went and got him. And they got his laptop, and I'm envisioning them kicking in his door, right? And they're grabbing him out. That's probably not what happened, but that's what my imagination. But yeah, went and got him and then detained him because they were worried that maybe he had evidence on his laptop that they needed to find out if he had been involved with this major incident. So I'm not in those conversations, right? I'm not a law enforcement officer, but they're talking to him, and it sounds like that he's been working with them in some way. Them as in maybe the FBI, and maybe helping give them information on the bigger fish, right? The bigger perpetrators. So they kind of slap him on the hand on the wrist, say, all right, listen, they don't arrest him, but they do, think about kicking him out of school. And so I'm like, they come and ask me. I'm like, okay, well, I'm not the decider of this, but I'll give you my opinion. And I said this, I said, look, based off of that first incident, I wish, really there's not enough evidence to kick somebody out of school, in my opinion. Like, there's things, people make mistakes. I don't trust him, right? But I don't think it's enough to kick him out of school. So sure enough, they don't kick him out of school. Now, I don't know if it was because of what I said, but they do give him community service. And then he comes and works community service for me. So he comes and works for me, and it's an awkward conversation because I'm like, hey man, how's it going? I was like, you know how you got picked up? That was because of me. yeah. Sorry, man. But I told him what happened and what I learned and what we did, right? Because we had to do due diligence to protect the university. And he didn't tell me like he didn't do anything, but he didn't also say he did do anything. But like I said, it was awkward. But I gave him something that I could keep eyes on him and really make sure he didn't get in trouble. He didn't work for us like in the SOC, put it that way. So we watched him until he graduated, and I was very happy to see him go. Right? So wrapping up, just a couple of things. So we have I have a podcast with my co-host, Steve, and we interviewed Matthew Dix and talked about his books. And it was a really great episode where we talked through these things and storytelling. And Matthew killed it. He's an amazing storyteller if you want to go listen to it. And we've also interviewed Dr. Ozier, Jerry, and I've known Jerry since he was in MUSC days down the road. I've known him a long time, and this is also, in my opinion, a very good, awesome conversation with him if you want to check it out. And I do have cool stickers, too, if anybody wants a sticker. And that's it. Go forth and tell stories.